All right. You said, I think you said socialism will never prevail, and also that I'm dumb on Twitter. Care to explain? Oh,
Yes, those
also
were
give
my
your pronouns
exact
and name.
words.
Give your pronouns and name to chat before they get mad at me.
Yes, yes. I also called you a socialist lib cuck at the same time.
Wait, before we start, does anybody like actually have? So I just froze Coke and like I'm having it like almost like a slushie, except I'm eating it with a spoon like this. Right? Does anybody like do this? Like I mean I do it and my like brother and whatnot do it, but I haven't like heard of it as like a thing. Is it like common? But yeah, let's continue.
Time somehow you can be both of those things.
It's been known.
No, so it's fair. I am Econoboi, he, him pronouns. In terms of an introduction, if yeah, what I do after I finished graduate school, mostly economics and finance focused, did poli sci undergrad as well. Decided that had a hell of a lot of free time after finishing school, so figured I'd get into making sort of educational videos, video essays on YouTube. I also do debates and stuff. So if you've ever had any sort of questions like, what should the corporate tax be? What's the stock market? What's
Okay, let's speed through these introductions.
quantitative easing? My YouTube videos on the Econoboi channel would probably be helpful enough. And I do a lot of capitalism versus socialism videos and debates as well.
And I take it your position is that the corporate tax rate should be 100%?
Like that's probably too extreme. I would say 90% maybe. Give 10% to the corporations, but 100% is a little extreme for my taste.
All right, I'll forgive your liberalism for now. We'll see how it pans out. Okay,
All
so
right.
I got in hot water, and I'm using that almost with a sort of mocking sarcasm when I say that, for saying that social democracies are still imperialist and still rely on economic inequality in order to produce their outcomes. Some people didn't like that, so I called them all libs and banned them. What do you take? Do you have anything you'd like to say before I call you a lib and ban you?
Well, what I would say is that please don't ban me because I'm one of the good ones.
All right, so basically, Vaush is arguing that social democratic systems still rely on imperialism to work, function, right? And yeah, so I mean, in my opinion, like capitalism itself doesn't really require imperialism to function. Like it's possible to have capitalism like without it, and you can like reform it or whatever. But I think it's important to sit here. Let's just revive that.
Well,
so I called them all libs and banned them. Democracies are still imperialist and still rely on economic inequality in order to.
So they're still imperialist and still rely on economic inequality to like function. Okay. Let me go back to normal speed or 1.25. I can't do normal speed.
To produce their outcomes. Some people didn't like that, so I called them all libs and banned them. What do you take? Do you have anything you'd like to say before I call you a lib and ban you?
Well, what I would say is that please don't ban me because I'm one of the good ones. But what I would say in regard to Nordic countries and sort of the bastions of social democracy that are held up by social democrats is that it is true to a certain extent their economies rely on you could say unequal exchange, labor exploitation in the third world. But the reality is that this percentage is relatively small, and so the prospect of reforming those supply chains and those systems under a capitalist framework is actually fairly feasible in today's context.
All right. There are a couple of angles we can take this from. I guess the first.
Yeah. So basically saying, hey, it's actually pretty feasible to reform capitalism to from a supply chain sort of perspective and labor standards sort of perspective to not rely on imperialism and whatnot.
First question that I would like answered is why would they reform that?
Okay, so this seems a little bit weird to me because like initially Vaush said that initially like the argument was kind of the system relies on this imperialism and whatnot, which is pretty like to me at least seems like, hey, this is required, it's a necessity, right, of the system. But now he's kind of saying why would they change it. So like those are two separate sort of arguments, right? Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe what he's trying to say is like, there's no way, you know, social democracy will ever flourish without imperialism or whatever. But that's different from saying it like necessarily relies on it. I mean, I guess the end outcome would be the same, like if social democracy actually relies on imperialism and whatnot, versus like if it just if like it's just never going to be able to get rid of imperialism. Like, I guess the end outcome is the same, but it's still like kind of a different argument, which is a bit weird. But hey, let's see.
Well, I mean, it's similar to like, why would someone buy an electric car today, right? I mean, people's priorities change over time. There's actually recently The Economist released a video. They do maybe I don't want to say weekly, maybe every other week they do videos, and this video was called like Too Woke or Too Broke or something like that, and they talked about the changing investment mindset, the idea that corporations are becoming increasingly pressured to be more socially conscious, and so there's sort of a ground up ability for that to happen and trickle into governments and corporations as well. But overall, though, I think that would be my answer, that people are becoming more societally conscious as the world becomes more globalized and the information age takes on maturity. And so people are going to want to see those reforms. I mean, for instance, even in I want to say there are countries that are looking at proposal and
Okay. So basically, hey, people, as information is spreading better and education is improving and things like that, people are becoming more informed about the issues, and as a result, they're going to want to see reforms and improvements to supply chains. So I think this is possible, but I think it won't necessarily gel well with like most Marxist views that capitalism and democracy are incompatible. So they would just argue like, hey, you know, it doesn't matter whether people will want that, right? They'll just say, you know, the capitalist overlords are just gonna handle it for us, right? Basically. But yeah, we'll see how it goes.
maybe a few countries have already banned things like slave labor from supply chains, or taking goods from Xinjiang region, things like that. So I think the prospect of what I'm talking about isn't totally unfeasible. At least I would say it's more feasible than a global socialist revolution.
Right. Well,
That's true.
I don't think a global socialist revolution is coming around the turn necessarily tomorrow. I'm only saying that as a capitalist economic system, social democracies are still going to rely fundamentally on many of the inequalities that we've propagated, to supply our business interests. So, like with regards to Norway's imports, I just take Norway. There are like a dozen countries we could use, but Norway is the one that I've been looking at a little more than others.
For sure.
Right. Now, I understand they get a lot of their stuff domestically, and their economy is sourced more ethically than the United States is, for sure. But it still seems like, I mean, if you were to cut out all trade, all imports from the third world or the developing world, I mean, Norway, like any other Western country, would be in dead water.
I mean, so I don't know that much about the actual like the empirical stuff, really. But basically, it seems like he's trying to argue like, hey, well, that's not necessarily the case. You know, it's still so. What's really confusing for me is whether he's arguing that the system like necessarily won't like can't rely on like has to rely on imperialism and whatnot. If that's the case, like giving examples saying like most systems do, like the common social democratic systems in the world today do rely on exploitation or whatever, is helpful, but it's not actually proving the point really, because you have to show that like that's because of some inevitability in the system, right? Like you'd have to prove that would always be the case, and not just like, okay, it's like that right now. I mean, like we could go like a few hundred years into the past, and people could argue like, oh, capitalism requires slavery, right? I mean, look at all the capitalist places, they use slavery, right? But obviously now we know that's not true, right? So yeah, I mean, it seems a little odd, but we'll see what happens.
And it seems like the only way to extricate yourself from that would be to economically cripple yourself by refusing to trade at all with like a significant portion of the exports produced in the world.
So this is like the argument that like, so while Vaush is saying that the system doesn't necessarily while he's saying like with his words that the system doesn't necessarily or like necessarily relies on imperialism and whatnot, I think what he means is that like today capitalist systems can't go. So okay, let me explain this. Let's use a function. All right. Or actually no, let's not use a function. That's too much. Too much STEM brain here. But basically he's saying that hey, while sure it's possible like theoretically that there could be a capitalist system which doesn't rely on exploitation and whatnot. Right now we're in an international system which does rely on these things, right? And as a result, we can't actually like no capitalist system, even if it becomes social democratic, is going to be able to get rid of that, or is going to be able to not rely on those things today. Like there's no path to there essentially. Even if it's like that thing might hypothetically exist. Like if someone created like a new system tomorrow, it could like it's not like logically impossible that it would social democratic systems would have to rely on capitalism or on imperialism and whatnot. Like it's possible. It's just that from where we are now, there's no way to get there without like no realistic way that we can get there, right?
You know.
So the narrative from what you're saying makes, narratively it makes sense. It's logical, but the issue is that it's not really necessarily bore out in the numbers. So, for instance, there was a really good, and it's quite an extreme
Ooh, Kevin. Bore out in the numbers. Wait, I need to get a. Actually, no, it's fine.
paper in terms of the hypothetical that they sort of take on in the paper. A couple economists, one from MIT, one from Berkeley, what they tried to answer was take the U.S. as an example. What if the U.S. just stopped trading? Just every single good and service that people might want, they would have to get it domestically, or they couldn't have it. What effect would this have if the U.S. basically embargoed the rest of the world in terms of importing goods? And that's including the global North countries, global South countries, rich and poor countries, mineral wealth, mineral rich, service rich countries. Well, what they found was that between 2 and 8% of GDP would be lost if the US totally and completely shut down its borders. Now, if you consider that the whole entire world, about, I did a video on this, about
2 and 8%
5%
of the American GDP.
Yes, just America as an example. But to speak a little bit more broadly, about 5% rounding up of the economy in the world, of the global North, I should say, not the world, is based on imports from the global South, about 5%. And so even in the extreme, well, because we have trade data, right? There's data on how much imports are from what countries and where they're going to, and obviously we have a classification for global South and North, and so you can calculate it with fair ease. Obviously, your currencies and stuff, but it's all out there.
But
now, really quick, what I was going to say,
it's worth by its cost, though, because like the argument that I would make.
Okay, you can't see the screen, but his chat is just saying that, so I guess I feel like you just saw it and said it's not like necessarily bad. Like it's okay to see the chat and get ideas, but yeah, I just thought that was kind of funny.
Is that it's undercosted in those areas? That's the reason why we.
Yeah. So basically, so Econoboi brings up the study. Vaush is just saying, hey, maybe one of the reasons why it, like in terms of monetary value, it seems so less is just because it's underpriced, right? And yeah,
we put all the trouble into engaging in neo-imperialism. You have these foreign countries where we do rely on this stuff they bring in. And also, just because it's a small portion of our GDP doesn't mean it's unimportant, Maybe 2% of our GDP goes towards lumbering, but you can't cut that out. The economy would die without that. It's not like 2% off the top, right? It's 2% out from a critical industry. It's like the difference between saying that you're removing like the roof tiling from a house, or you're removing like a load-bearing pillar. Like how much of a percentage of our
Sorry. It seems weird to take US as an example though, because I don't know if I'm remembering this correctly, but I'm pretty sure the US has like pretty good natural resources, like for like a country of its size and locality. Like I'm pretty sure that the U.S. has a pretty like good set of natural resources. Like, so even if it like stops trading, it has access to like some stuff from like locally, right? Like a place like Britain or somewhere doesn't really have the same level of natural resources, right? So they might be in more trouble. So it seems a bit weird to take U.S. as an example. But I mean, they're both sound Americans, so yeah, probably that's probably right. But yeah.
GDP goes into like rare earth mineral stuff like lithium, right? But if we didn't have any of that, even if it counted for just 0.1% of our total GDP, we would be fucked, right? So it clearly relies on more than just that.
Not necessarily. So we to a certain extent we would be fucked if we didn't have lithium. That's true, but most every good has some sort of applicable substitute. So you're talking about like lithium batteries for whatever use you might have. Obviously, you can use nickel, you can use cobalt, things like that.
Not
now
for modern
that's
batteries.
just a
you need lithium, right? That's the modern battery
well,
that we use.
no, that's true, and I don't want to get bogged down in an incredibly specific example, but it's just a matter of like what they took into account for their analysis is the substitutability of trade. So the idea would be that, and this is why they give a range, so 2 to 8%. Now, if goods are incredibly substitutable, right?
Yeah, so basically, he's saying that, well, yeah, you know, so maybe some important things would be lost, but these economists are taking into account, like, can you substitute these goods easily, right? Like, can you substitute this good with another sort of similar good, right? Like a different sort of battery or a different sort of, material or whatever, right?
If the U.S. produced the goods that we get abroad, but domestically, given the amounts that we have domestically, how substitutable are these? If they're incredibly substitutable, gains from trade are actually very low. If they're not very substitutable, gains from trade are very, very high. Because if we can just substitute things out, well, we don't need to trade. If we absolutely cannot.
Dude, this chat is like insane. Wait, can I just want to check to make sure I can like share the screen. Should be able to. There we go. Yeah. Okay.
Substitute things out, we absolutely need to trade. Now, the point that I was going to make is that it is true that arguably it's a naive and sort of shallow analysis to just look at trade accounting to answer this question, how reliant is the global north on the global south? But I think that you can also look at the actual specific question. You can look at unequal exchange, right?
So I think this is pretty interesting. Basically, like this is one thing which kind of which I think is really cool that Econoboi does. Like, he's not like afraid to just kind of talk about, oh, you know, this analysis I just did kind of has this limitation, right? We might not know this. This might not really show something or the other, right? Or this model kind of covers a lot of things but has some mistakes. Like, he actually talks about like, hey, I might be missing out on certain areas. I might be missing out on certain ideas, and things like that, which is pretty cool. But yeah, oh my god, it's only been like 10 minutes. Okay, I need to like speed through this a little bit faster.
Which is how much lower are, sort of the importers, basically, you could say the importers, but how much lower are the people in global south nations being paid relative to their production, relative to the production of workers in the global north? The difference is unequal exchange. And even that specific number, obviously it's even less because it's specific. It's only 3 or 4% of GDP. That's in the video when you start arguing with your chat about people citing the 3%. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about actually the specific amount that is transferred in wealth in terms of they have this much productivity, but they're paid less for it, for some structure, some other reason or another. It's only about 3-4% of GDP, which the last thing I'd say,
3 to 4,
sure, go on.
3 to 4% of our GDP is accounted for by the relative gains that we achieve by relying on the lower pay that we can get in those developing countries.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so I think like Vaush kind of explained it better than Econoboi, to be honest. But yeah,
isn't that like 1 trillion USD though? I mean, you say like 3% of our GDP, like it's a tiny hit that we could weather, but you're basically describing like the hit that we took from COVID. That on its own.
Okay. When people talk about relative versus like specific measures, that this like annoys me. Like anybody who hears 1 trillion USD is like shocked, right? And like that's why we use relative measures in the first place, so like we can actually understand this in like the context of these really massive systems, right? So I hate when like people switch it and just use, oh, isn't that like 1 trillion USD? I mean, like he seems to be making like an understandable point for the rest of it, but why, like, that to me just seems like a blatant sort of emotional punch sort of situation. But yeah.
Oh, and just that, like the wage differential, would be enough to single-handedly like bring about a recession, if not like worse.
No, you're absolutely right. That was the second thing I was going to say when you jumped in, which was that it's absolutely the case. If you look at global North GDP over time, what you'll find is that we lost about anywhere from 3 to 4% of GDP as a result of the COVID downturn, a little under 3% of GDP as a result of the previous recession, 2008, 2009. So the idea of overnight getting rid of literally all unequal exchange is it would cause a recession, but the idea that you espouse and that a lot of socialists espouse, which is that it is unsustainably the case that nations in the global north could never reform out of this. It's just not true. Even if they did it tomorrow, flick your hands and all unequal exchange is gone and there's worker parity across the world, you'd get a bad recession, but we'd make it out of it. We've had worse recessions before, but also that's not what anyone's advocating for. The reality is what most people would advocate for is change over time over 10, 20, 30 year period, similar to any sort of.
Okay, I keep getting triggered by the chat, but like, okay, so the reason you bring up the GDP number is, okay, so I understand it sounds small because like 3% sounds small, but it's not, and like Econoboi understands this as well. But I think one issue of his is he doesn't really talk about it from he doesn't really recognize that like economists think of this differently from like normal people. But like the point is to compare it with like other GDP falls, right? Like COVID, for example, and he was going to say that, right? And like to show that, hey, to get an idea of how bad it is from that, right? Not just like, oh, it's 3%, it's like a small number. It's not, right? But like just to say like, hey, this is something we've bared before, right? And it's like it's a cost that we can actually weather, right? It's not like if we do this, the entire economy is like irrecoverably damaged, right? But yeah.
Reformist, and that would of course depress any sort of absolutely destructive effects of getting rid of unequal exchange.
The issue that I have with this is twofold. First of all, I don't think it's theoretically impossible to do without it. I just don't think capitalist countries will do it.
This is so now he's making it clearer, but it was a bit confusing in the beginning is the problem, right?
Countries have a long-standing history of engaging in some pretty nefarious behavior if it maintains the interests of their business consult. I mean, it seems like if I were to defer to history, like we're talking about countries that the CIA has literally overturned democratically elected leaders. I mean, we've invaded countries in large part because it benefits our business interests, because it makes us wealthy, because it transfers wealth from their country to ours. We'll install leaders who are okay with the economic changes we enforce on their nation. The World Bank and the IMF serve as the neocolonial arms of regime change, where we.
Okay. This is interesting because I think last time I kind of talked a little bit about the different international relations theorems or whatever. But basically we have three, right? We have realism, liberalism, and Marxism, right? So So liberals actually are very explicitly pro-capitalism and explicitly say like we should encourage other countries to become capitalist, right? So their argument for this is basically that they have three values: freedom to elect one's own government, freedom of conscience, which is things like free speech and stuff, and freedom of opportunity, which is basically to liberals capitalism, right? And they think that these three should be spread, and if you engage in true freedom to elect one's own government, it'll naturally lead to the other two. It'll lead to freedom of speech. It'll lead to capitalism. And they would basically argue that liberal democracies in general are more peaceful with each other. So the U.S. is more peaceful with Britain, with Canada, and things like that. And so that's why we should encourage other countries to become liberal democracies as well. Then they have different reasons why, like they're becoming less. Why liberal democracies are less sort of. How should I say this? Are less likely to go to war with each other, basically. So they think like a liberal world order is a peaceful world order, essentially, right? Whereas a Marxist would also argue that countries should, or not should, countries do push for capitalism, but they have completely different reasons for it. They would argue it's for the corporation's interest, right? And that's interesting because technically, like, liberals would argue peace is in corporations' interest, or like is in nations' interests. So that's like an interesting sort of parallel between liberals and Marxists, where in some ways they kind of agree, right? But yeah. Oh wait, wait a second. Let me fix this for a sec. 1 second. There we go. Okay. I was wondering why the camera looks
say they can get the money they need to build up a country, but only if they neoliberalize in ways that make them good targets for us. So it's not about like, is it impossible to do this? It's about whether or not it's going to happen with the incentives that we have right now, you know? But I also want to add to that as well. I'm not convinced by this whole like which percentage of the GDP accounting narrative thing, right? So most of the GDP here in America doesn't come from manufacturing or imports. It comes from the service economy. That's like 2/3 of our economy right there. So you say that like if we cut out all goods from China, which is about $500 billion a year, you know, if we didn't import anything from them, and that's just China.
Don't use those numbers, please. Nobody understands what $500 billion means. Like if Vaush said 1 trillion instead, like nobody would know the difference, right? Just use like percent of GDP or something. That's better. But yeah.
That it would only account for like 3% of our GDP. Okay, but those are goods we're bringing in. Maybe it accounts for 3% of our total GDP, but how much of it does it account for the GDP related to the actual consumption and use of physical things that we bring in from the rest of the world? If 2/3 of our GDP is trapped in the service industry, which is dependent upon the stuff that we import from other countries, that change is magnified significantly, you know? It's like saying, you know, it's like saying that if you stop eating like citrus foods, you know, take it all off across the board. It takes it off in vital ways that have a disproportionate effect on the economic outcome.
Cool.
Sure. So I guess to respond sort of point by point. So obviously, I think if you claim to be speaking more hyperbolically previously, I do accept the olive branch of that it's not theoretically impossible. What I would say is that in terms of capitalist countries won't do it, you know, they won't reform. I would say that this is not necessarily, and I know it's a shocking thing for a lot of people, is that this is also not necessarily bore out in the numbers. Obviously, people might reference you know, the fact that social spending as a percentage of GDP across the Western and sort of global North world has only increased, and it's only increased relatively precipitously over time. The economies of the world are spending more and more on welfare and on things that would increase equality, decrease inequality. And obviously, if we're talking about Nordic countries, that's times 100, basically. In regard to sort of the historical analysis of the CIA and the IMF, I disagree in part with, you know, the CIA has sort of led particularly to the stifling of good socialist government across the world. I would take a more national security view. I mean, for instance, if
okay, this is one area where like this is like super difficult to, you can't like talk about the CIA or IMF like doing something or the other unless you're like, that's what your debate is about, like because for leftists this is intuitive, this is just like facts, right? So you can't talk about, I don't think the IMF is like an arm of neocolonial regime change or whatever. I think it's just like a bank or something. But like you can't say that and like expect that to get over soon. It's going to be, that is like, you basically have to go through like the entirety of leftist theory to like talk about that and either prove or disprove it. Like but yeah, so I mean, this part, how long is this gonna be? Wait, bro. Okay, come on. Okay. All right. Fine, I guess. Let's see.
The U.S. was so incredibly, you know, diametrically opposed to communism that they kill every.
See that facial expression? Basically what I said, right? It's so intuitively like true. So obviously, like anybody who says this has automatically lost like the rhetoric game, unless like you have to like unless you're actually going in like talking about that, right? If you're just saying, oh, you know, I don't agree with this, you have to give like you have to like really like prove it. So I think like when I say really prove it, I think a lot of the times people think like the more effort you need to defeat an argument necessarily means the argument's better, but that's not necessarily true. You know, it's really hard to like combat someone like a conspiracy theorist or whatever. That doesn't mean like their arguments are good. It's just that there's like so many like different things you have to know, a lot of like random facts, right? And just like know them off and be able to like talk about them, right? Like to for anti-vax stuff, right? You have to talk about all sorts of like wild like theories and stuff. Like, oh my, I think most recent one, like Fauci did some like weird shit with dogs or whatever, like tortured dogs, or did some crazy shit for like their for his like medical for some like study or whatever. Like there's just like all sorts of stuff, right? And you have to know about it to like be able to combat it, right? The problem is, especially with conspiracy theorists, you can't like trust what they say and say like, okay, you know, if that's true, so on and so forth, because like the entire like it being true is like the entire like argument, right? And similarly for this one, it's not exactly the same. Like leftists aren't necessarily conspiracy theorists, but like it's just that there's so many different specific examples, and you kind of have to, you'd almost have to disprove them all, because like if you just talk about one example, right, and say, okay, you know, this was like more complicated, blah blah blah, then like your opponent can just say like, oh well, what about like these other 20 examples, right? And it's just like, okay, God, I have to like disprove each and every one of these, right? And like, so obviously a stronger way to go about this is say like, well, why do you think that, right? Then they can say, oh, is like it's obvious. Like say like, oh, it's not obvious, you know. I don't agree. What reason do you have to believe that? And you know, they might say, oh well, for example, in this so and so country, and like you have to know this, but then you can say like, oh, actually, like in this country, so and so happened and whatnot.
Communist movement around. Why did we give military and aid in general to the Yugoslavian government under Tito in 1951? Well, it's because it was a national security interest.
Well, you know? Right, because he was able to push a wedge against the USSR by doing so. But I'm not.
Absolutely.
There's no national security.
Yeah. Okay. So this was like a. Yeah. I mean, the problem is, I think like both of these explanations can kind of, generally speaking, you could like. Okay, so I feel like there are three things which are really important in like creating a hypothesis about like the world in this way. Like, is IMF like an arm of neocolonial regime change or whatnot? One is simplicity. Like, you don't want to assert like all these random things which you don't have proof for, even if it still like explains the like the evidence you do have, because like it's just like a less simple, you know, worldview, right? And it relies on more proof that you don't have, right? Two is, I think, some sort of rigidity. Like, there are some worldviews where no matter what happens, you can always justify them, right? Like, conspiracy theorist worldviews are very often like this, right? You know, like the world is being controlled by, you know, some like crazy elites, right? Literally nothing can disprove it, because everything which would quote unquote disprove it is just more proof for, hey, this is bullshit, right? Or hey, you know, what do you call this? Or hey, you know, they actually just manipulated the numbers in this way. So I feel like a good sort of hypothesis should be possible to like disprove. It shouldn't be so flexible that it can apply to literally like any situation, right? Like, okay, so this might be a tangent. I'll touch on it after I finish the third point. And so first point is simplicity. Second point is should be possible to disprove, and I think third point should be how do we say it? I mean, okay. Third point is just like, okay, it's in line with the evidence, right? Like, it's not it's you know, it explains what happened and it actually like based on what really happened, not like some whatever bullshit, right? But yeah. So the tangent I was going on is like, this is kind of similar, but basically to me it feels like Vaush's like moral theory, like his form of utilitarianism and whatnot, is extremely flexible. Like, I feel like it could justify almost any action that he would plausibly take, right? Like, okay, you support, you know, socialists, or okay, to give an example, like for Hassan, right? You can easily say like, on one hand, if he doesn't want to support Hassan, he could say like, oh, you know, he's doing so and so bad things, we should tell him not to, right? Simple, right? And he shouldn't. And, you know, it's bad that he doesn't do this, right? if he does want to support his son, well, oh, he's doing so and so bad things, but it's like bad to like tell him not to, and because it would discourage people from joining the movement or something, right? Like there isn't like a rigidity to easily say like, according to your system, this is right, this is wrong. I mean, there is like to a certain extent, like you can obviously say murder is wrong with Vaush's system, but like nothing that he's actually plausibly gonna do, right? Like he's not like it's not plausible that Vaush is gonna like randomly come and like commit murder, right? And like try to justify it with his moral system, right? Like things which he might actually do. But yeah.
Security interest. What you're talking about right now, our national security interest is our business interests. Those are one and the same. Economically being starved out is functionally the same as losing political power. We've enforced regime change in tons of countries across the world, from the Middle East to Southeast Asia to Latin America to Central America. Like, these weren't done because these guys are like going to bomb our country or whatever. We did it because we wanted leaders in there that were willing to trade with us instead of with the USSR. We're clearly willing to kill to make sure that our businessmen can get the contracts they need.
Okay, yeah, national security is like related to money like really strongly, so that is true. I think it's like weird to say like, okay, they're not going to bomb us or whatever. Like, yeah, of course they're not going to bomb us, but like security is more than that, right? Didn't you just say that, right? But yeah.
No, and I would never take the view that this has never happened, right? I in fact totally agree with the idea that business interests, sort of economic interests more broadly, is of a national security importance, to some extent or another, right? My only point was that the focus is more a national security interest and not some sort of fervent hatred for communism abroad. For
I never
instance,
said
again,
it was
if
about fervent hatred for communism. I just think it's about securing business interests.
well, national security interests. I get what you're saying. We might be speaking past each other. I was also going to reference the socialist Rajavan government as well as a government that the U.S. gets helps out a decent amount.
I don't think they have an ideological opposition to like the building of socialism. I think they have an ideological opposition to things that don't make their companies money. Usually the two overlap, but if they don't, then
Okay, that's so it's interesting that basically, so there's two competing explanations for why you do something. One is national security, and the other is this business interests. And business interests are kind of related to national security, because security will care about like their country being like economically strong and things like that. But national security isn't necessarily like business interests. Like there, like lots of businesses profit during wars, right? Lots of businesses will profit from instability, right? Things like that. So, like generally speaking, I don't think like these aren't equivalent, right? So I think that's just the that's the subtle difference between like what they're saying, right? But yeah.
Well, I think yes and no. Obviously, I'm not a historian, so I'm not able to provide an incredibly in-depth analysis. But again, I do think over time it's proven that generally countries have become more amicable to redistribution and social spending. And I do think that, especially in a present-day context, I don't know if there's a lot of justification for like the CIA is and the IMF and the World Bank are still currently serving as quote neo-colonial arms of regime change. But the second point you brought up, sure, go on. No, I don't think so. I mean, like when you to be fair, maybe there is a modern day example of the CIA like totally getting rid of socialist governments today. I'm not sure, but the point is that a lot of those instances, again, are more focused on national security, not necessarily like there's no reason that a socialist country doesn't sort of participate in the markets. I mean, even the Soviet Union did that as well. It's just a matter of national security interests. But the IMF and the World Bank are
they're literally
banks,
examples of the CIA getting involved because socialist governments were nationalizing industries, which meant that they could no longer like make money off it.
Yeah, I'm talking about like no, I agree. There's examples of that. People people speak about like the Iran government in the 1950s that got overthrown, sort of allegedly or supposedly. I'll give it to you about the nationalizing of the oil industry. I get all that.
Allegedly,
right?
It's happened a lot. I mean, like the regime change.
No,
I know. I'm just saying it's not about like ideological opposition to communism. It's just like this definitely has happened a lot, And the IMF and the World Bank, these aren't like lefty criticisms. This has happened. Like the criticism section for the IMF is pretty specific in detailing that
like I think the issue here is that I don't think he's necessarily disagreeing with this happened and the CIA did this thing. It's just the overall framework for explaining why they do those things, right? I think they're kind of talking past each other here, but yeah.
Many countries and organizations think that they're essentially like loan sharks and strongmen whose job it is to incentivize the economic developments that pull money away from welfare programs and away from nationalization and towards like pro-Western business interest stuff,
Well, it depends, right? So again, I'm not going to disagree with some of that historical analysis that yes, the CIA and the U.S. government more broadly, or the global north even more broadly, have engaged in nefarious practices that have stifled ostensibly communist countries. Obviously, you can argue about Vietnam and Soviet, whether they're communist or not, whatever. I mean, you get what I'm saying. When it comes to the IMF and the World Bank, there's both liberal and socialist and right-wing, frankly, criticisms of those institutions. What they are fundamentally are banks. They're banks charged with getting interest back on the loans that they give. You only need a loan from the IMF or the World Bank. The World Bank less so because they do more development aid, but you only need a loan from the IMF if your country is in relatively dire financial straits. And so the idea of the IMF instituting conditional financing so that they can get their money back on their loans, again, I don't think it's necessarily a communism or capitalism thing. Capitalist countries have been strapped with IMF debt that they've been unsustainably able to repay. So
Okay. Yeah, I think like it's just talking past each other. Like I don't think he's necessarily trying to defend the IMF here. He's just trying to say like there are different explanations for it than you're giving, right? Like I think that's kind of the issue. Like Econoboi isn't really like he isn't like trying to moralize it, saying the IMF is good or bad. He's just trying to say what is the best sort of thing, right?
I think that the IMF,
part of the
and what I was going to say that the last sentence was that the IMF and the World Bank's modus operandi is more sort of ideologically neutral than anything.
I'm not saying they're going after socialists. I'm just saying that they're doing whatever they can to make sure that these countries are amicable to Western business interests. They'll do that to capitalist countries too if they need to. They would do it to us if they needed to. But there's a precondition.
When you say amicable to Western business interests, what do you mean by that? Because when I think of like
about the
getting someone to repay a loan, I mean,
bribe, right?
You know,
well, they offer financial assistance on the condition that you liberalize your economy, which means that you open it up to the kinds of systems that allows the West to take advantage of them.
You'd have to give some specifics. In my experience researching the IMF, not the World Bank again, because they do more development aid, and I don't know if anybody's really against development aid, but the IMF specifically, a lot of the aid that they extend to nations is more based on, hey, I'm in almost every country in the world is a member of the IMF. Hey, I'm X nation. I am financially in an incredible dire spot, and the IMF might come in, lend them a bunch of money to refinance their debt. And again, because they're a bank, they want to get their money back. And so part of that might be getting rid of like wasteful bureaucratic spending, or balancing the fiscal state. None of which are necessarily good things in when you're dealing with a recession. But again, if you're taking a loan from the IMF, I mean, you need to pay it back. It creates moral hazard if you don't.
I'm not talking about paying back the loan. I'm talking about the conditions. This is in the section conditionality of loans.
Yeah, like I mean, Econoboi was also talking about the conditions. He's saying like he's basically trying to argue that these conditions aren't because you need to be amicable to Western business interests. It's more because hey, we want to make sure you're able to pay back our loans, and because of that, we want you to do certain things, right? Like these macroeconomic imbalances.
IMF conditionality is a set of policies or conditions the IMF requires in exchange for financial resources. The IMF does require collateral from countries for loans, but also requires the government seek assistance to correct its macroeconomic imbalances in the form of policy reform. If the conditions are not met, the funds are withheld. The concept of conditionality was introduced in a 1952 executive board decision, coincidentally right after the Cold War began, and later incorporated into the Articles of Agreement. Stuff like cutting expenditures and raising revenues, also known as austerity, focusing economic output on direct export and resource extraction. That's interesting. See, the way most wealthy countries today are wealthy is that they focused on more advanced education and technological development, but they're encouraging these countries to focus on raw resource extraction, which makes them very easy targets for Western industries and markets to buy up the stuff that they sell for cheap. The devaluation of currencies, trade liberalization, increasing stability of investment, balancing budgets, removing price controls and state subsidies, privatization or divestiture of all or part of state-owned industries, enhancing the rights of foreign investors, improving governance and fighting corruption. Now, some of these are good, like balancing budgets. I mean, fine, but this is very clearly about making these countries like useful to the West with regards to trade relations.
Right, and I think the issue with reading that off is that it presumes that those are actual requirements in every instance of lending. It just depends on the country, right? So for instance, if you're like Chile, for instance, and Chile, this is not the case currently, but say that you're Chile, right, and you're in dire financial straits. Obviously, the IMF is going to recommend that you expand your production of copper because that's a natural resource that you have. And of course, it would make sense if you need money to pay off debt that you would expand your capacity to mine copper, right?
Do you think it's like
obviously
a coincidence that all of these things are beneficial to like the West when it comes to trading with them? Like, what about the four tigers of Asia, like Singapore and stuff? A lot of those countries became very wealthy, not by focusing on mining a bunch of oil and selling it off to the West, but actually by engaging in a fuck ton of nationalist...
so, basically, Vaush is arguing, hey, they do this wrong thing, right? It kind of coincides with the Western business interests. Why, right? Is it because, they want to, support Western business interests and aren't really interested in actually, improving the countries or, actually making them less likely to default, right? It's possible that, for example, maybe doing certain maybe doing the technological advancement and whatnot that Vaush is talking about is a good way to become a wealthy country, but maybe it's not necessarily the most secure way for a country to to pay off their loans, right? For example, like technological development and stuff would require a lot of investment, not necessarily, but could require a lot of investment from the government and things like that, right? And that might not be necessarily the best strategy for the IMF to collect loans, right? Because, okay, now this government is paying all this stuff, but I needed to be able to pay me back, right? But yeah, I mean, that's like the IMF isn't interested in necessarily improving the country. It's just maximizing the likelihood that they would pay their loans, right?
Local like pricing control
Or
and
pay
a lot
their
of what is it called when you're when you like prioritize local industry?
Like protectionism?
Yeah, protectionism. Yeah. These countries that actually managed to claw their way out of poverty engaged in protectionism, built up their own industries, and rejoined the world economies when they had something unique to offer. We know that strategy works, but the IMF is advocating for the opposite: liberalization, deinvestiture, denationalization, focus on just mining more gold, more lithium, more oil. That might be good for stabilizing the budget immediately, but this is so very clearly like just a way of making these countries profitable for Western business investment. Why else?
Why else? Now,
Would making enhancing the rights of foreign investors be one of the things they focus on?
Well, because one of the ways that you can build wealth in your country is to encourage foreign investment, right? So, for instance, if we look at the example of Botswana, which a lot of people sort of hold up as an example of African development, it's one of the most developed countries in Africa. What the leaders of Botswana did after the current party in power actually first took power, which I think was in like the 1950s or something like that, what they did was engage in a lot of foreign investment and public-private partnerships to develop their natural resources and retain a large part of that wealth. And as a response to that private investment and good governance and sort of anti-corruption policies of the early governments, Botswana is the most, arguably the most developed country in Africa. I mean, you mentioned the four Asian.
okay, I think like generally speaking, this stuff sort of like I heard like there's a lot of criticism for this part of the debate, but so far it seems all right. Like there are like talking past each other a little bit, but there is also some actual like addressing the points and whatnot, right? Wait.
And tigers, a significant part of all of those countries' economies is looking outward trade. Now, if you want to have an argument about the domestic sort of production capacity and protectionism, if you're more in favor of protectionism or something like that, that's not an unreasonable argument to be had. It's not like totally unreasonable. It's just that when the IMF recommends policy changes, they're not recommending it with the idea of we want to prop up the global neo-colonial business interest. It's we're a bank lending money, and these are the conditions by which your country, at least historically is the case, are able to build wealth depending on the country and
build wealth versus pay back the loan, right?
will be able thusly to pay back your debt and finance yourself more sustainably.
So build wealth in order to pay back the loan, not like build wealth in order to like be, you know, a wealthy country or something.
This is, but no, I'm sorry. This is either dishonest or delusional. The IMF and the World Bank are clearly economically partisan organizations. They have been widely criticized for not actually engaging in the kind of.
You can't just say like widely criticized. Like he accepts that they've been widely criticized and whatnot. Like he's not saying that it's like a good thing that they're doing these things or whatever. He's just saying like there's a different explanation for why they're doing it.
Policy prescriptions that make countries better. In fact, the universality of their conditions is one of the things they often get criticized for. They don't take into consideration what's good for that country. Instead, they just apply a blanket set of pro-Western business interests. I'm not opposed to trade, but Botswana is an interesting case.
I mean, if they were like super like, okay, I want to improve the Western business interests, wouldn't they wouldn't they want to wouldn't they like want to look at each individual country and how those countries could best benefit like Western interests? Like that part doesn't necessarily prove or disprove like the Western interest. That's just more of a either incompetence or lack of resources, or you know, just we don't want to spend a ton of time, you know, looking at individual things or whatever. Right?
For you to cite, because their economy is all diamonds. What do you think is going to happen when the world demand for diamonds falls off? That country is going to burn. Botswana's entire economy is dependent on making sure that global diamond trade and demand is high. The United States is not. South Korea is not. Countries with strong, robust economies don't rely on the export of a single rare material. We saw this happen in Venezuela. Whenever you focus your economy on the export of a single commodity, if prices crash, that's it. All your people starve. Botswana hasn't built itself a strong economy. It's just riding a bubble for as long as it has diamonds, and diamonds sell well. But that's not the same thing. Like 10 years from now, you realize Botswana might end up being the next Venezuela, right? Like the next thing people look at and go, oh, wow, they should have diversified.
Well, no, not necessarily. So the answer is theoretically yes. I'm certainly not being dishonest when talking to you, and I'm not defending the IMF necessarily. I think I have my own criticisms for the IMF as well. In the video that I made about the IMF, one of the final points that I made was that indeed you can hate the IMF and not like what they do. It's just that you should do it for the right reasons, right? Conditional financing is bad, not because it stifles socialist government abroad, but because when socialist governments get in financial trouble and they go into a recession, they don't necessarily need to cut spending further. Everyone agrees that austerity is bad, but IMF is not concerned with, well, if I can finish, the IMF isn't necessarily concerned with how do I put it? Getting these countries out of recession. They're concerned with countries being able to sustainably finance themselves and getting their money back on their loans. They're a bank.
They care about They care about making these countries ripe for liberal investment. That's why all of their conditions are amicable to that. Otherwise,
um like I feel like these sorts of debates where you're debating, hey, this perspective on the set of facts versus that perspective, you can't like say, oh well, my thing explains all the facts or whatever, right? Like, I think you have to kind of take a more offensive approach, like saying your perspective doesn't explain this, right? And whatnot. So that, I think that's the first step. So the most important thing is that whatever perspective you take should explain the existing evidence, right? Adequately. And the second thing you could do is start saying, okay, well, you don't have evidence for this aspect, right? That's the simplicity part where you try to simplify your perspective. And what was the third thing I said? Oh yeah, it's like is it flexible or not, right? Like, and you can ask like, what would it take to disprove this perspective, right? So I feel like those are sort of the central questions these need to be focused on.
otherwise they would not focus on some of the stuff that they focus on here. I mean, it's so clearly.
Okay, so now he's kind of attacking it, but he can't just say it so clearly. He has to say, like, for example, if just being a bank, they wouldn't focus on like doing so, like limiting food subsidies, for example, right?
Like long-term adjustment policies usually includes, we talked about privatization and divestiture, you know, and making things easier for foreign governments, reducing government expenditure and government employment. In what world is reducing government expenditure on developing infrastructure not damaging to these countries? Every successful country in the world today spends a lot of government money on building out infrastructure, on securing basic provisions.
Yeah, so like he agrees with this. He says like, yeah, the IMF is, he actually didn't explicitly say that this was like bad, right? I don't know.
Existence, but they encourage you not to do that because they don't care if these people have an educated population. They care
Yeah,
if
they don't.
they have a population that's well fed enough to work in the oil rigs or the diamond mines that they can then sell off to Western businesses. Botswana is wealthy because De Beers and those other diamond companies in the West buy up the products that they sell. This is a favorable enterprise to us, and
It can be favorable, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's like intentionally, fighting for Western business interests, right?
unfavorable one to them because we're denying them the ability to develop a truly autonomous economic situation. Like we're just relying on raw resource extraction.
I don't think so. The goal of most any economy, especially smaller nations that might not.
Yeah, so like normally I think most political pundits or whatever, I don't know, I feel like a lot of people take a lot of offense with the word political pundit, but that's basically like what these people are, right? But most of them would like, essentially what they do is they try to make it seem like their perspective is the natural conclusion of these facts. Like it's just like, this is the only like possible view, right? So they're rarely going to say like, hey, your perspective, it fits the facts, but so and so is the problem, right? Or they'll rarely say like, okay, one second. They'll rarely say like, oh, your perspective does so and so. Actually, wait, hold on. I'll be back. I'm back. Okay.
Not have as much sort of diversified resource wealth isn't necessarily to be autonomous, right? Because again, you said you're in favor of trade. Of course, you'd understand that trade requires specialization to a certain extent, and with specialization and sort of engaging in international trade, you can build wealth that way. That's what Botswana has done. For instance, when you could look at Norway as another example where they've really leaned in to their oil wealth, right? Now, what they've done is taken a lot of that wealth and put it in a social wealth fund, diversify that wealth fund, and then put that money right back into the economy in the form of
this is not
many different
comparable.
investments.
If diamond prices go down, Botswana crashes. If oil prices go down, which they have, Norway has a diversified economy that can survive because Norway is in the imperial core where we apply economic policies that make sure we survive, that prioritize our growth and our development.
So the why is the important part here.
Whereas Botswana is in the imperial periphery, which exists only insofar as it is useful to our businesses, and we couldn't give a damn about them otherwise. This is exactly the same thing that China's doing, but they're better at it. The Belt and Road Initiative at least involves a degree of infrastructural investment. That means these countries aren't going to crash the next time oil or diamond or lithium prices fluctuate based on the next recession. We have to be like, this is an incredibly inequitable exchange. Earlier in this convo, you talked about how the US could like shrug off no longer trading with China, which I disagree with, but at least we do have a diversified economy.
Well,
they don't have that.
Fair.
Okay, but they don't have that luxury. These other countries, now South Korea does, Singapore does. They could do that because they have diversified economies, but Botswana could not. They rely on us completely and totally, which means that we can do anything we want to them because they have no recourse.
Again, you're well. To be fair, again, I don't think Botswana.
Vaush is like really aggressive in this conversation. I feel like he's kind of basically talking about I feel like Econoboi was just about to say like, hey, um so you need to start by doing this and then switch to that or whatever, but start by like specializing and then diversify or something. But yeah, we'll see.
Botswana is absolutely singularly a diamond economy. Of course, they're diversified to a certain
It's
extent.
62% of their exports is diamonds, and the majority of their GDP comes from the wealth they gain from
He was
exports.
just
A lot of other
ready.
stuff that they sell, like up to 80% in total alongside the diamonds, is stuff like nickel. It's other earth minerals and metals they mine out.
Yeah, no, I'm not, certainly wouldn't take the position that diamonds are not a significant part of the Botswanan economy. It's only the idea that the argument that you're making is more or less, how do I put it? Like, essentially, the argument that you seem to be making is that Botswana's economy is bad, and though they have built a lot of wealth from their diamond mines, it is not necessarily the most sustainable, because at some point maybe diamonds become worthless, and all of a sudden a third of their economy just gets wiped off the map because they've not diversified. Now, to a certain extent, that's true. But that's why I bring up the idea of like Norway, where they have taken advantage of their resource wealth very much so, and they've diversified it, arguably in a more responsible way than what Botswana has done. Right now, we can make sort of these arguments about, Botswana's economy is not as diversified, Norway's economy, maybe the social wealth fund's good or bad, whatever. The whole point.
Oh my god, this chat is so like seething. Like he said, 1/3 of the economy, not 1/3 of the exports.
Point that I'm trying to get at is that the IMF, flaws and all, good or bad, whatever, is not necessarily an institution that's based sort of singularly on stifling good socialist governments abroad. I mean, for instance, Ecuador took it. Well, what I was going to say, hold on. For instance, what I was going to say was that Ecuador recently took a financing agreement with the IMF, and it's not like Ecuador had to get rid of their national oil company, right? So it's a lot of examples and nuance in all this
I'm not
analysis
saying
that I
that
think
they
we
always
miss.
do all of their preconditions, but they're always trying to make these countries more amicable to Western business investment. And I've never said it's about taking down socialist countries. I'm only saying that they're trying to make these countries easier to invest in. They'll do that to fewer
Easier to
countries.
invest in, or more amicable to like interest? Like, okay, I guess easier to investment in is more amicable. Like, is that the only thing which makes it more amicable? I don't know. I mean, he like I don't know. I feel like, especially in a discussion with like someone who has 2 masters in different like economics related fields, like you want to be specific with your terminology, but maybe it's easier if you're not.
They need to. It's not.
You did say that the IMF was an arm of neo-colonial regime change. Which
Yes, that is
think
objectively the case. But they'll do that to
Okay,
anyone
well,
who's not favorable to what.
Okay. So like when it comes to, especially from like an economics point of view, a lot of one thing which I noticed in a lot of economic sort of discussion in classes and whatnot is that like we have, okay, one sec, let's pull up Paint. Okay, we have like different facts, right? Or I should draw it like that. We have different facts, right? So, and then we have these facts, and then we have a theory to explain these facts, right? So the theory is underlying the facts. So, for example, the IMF is a tool of neo-colonial regime change, right? So you can't say it's objectively the case just because the theory explains all the facts, right? You'd have to like there, because there could be multiple theories which explain all the facts, right? And obviously not all of them can be objectively correct, right? So you have to pick like the best theory for the thing which you're gunning for, right? Sometimes you can think of these theories as abstractions, which simplify like a really complicated sort of situation, right? So, for example, the IMF isn't like one entity; it's like comprised of tons of people, right? So like obviously, so we're kind of abstracting here over that like kind of more complicated reality, right? And essentially you just need to argue that for whatever purposes you're trying to figure things out, your theory is more helpful and more understandable, right? But yeah, so like it's hard to talk about correct in these cases, but yeah, I mean, there can definitely be theories which are wrong, right? Which don't explain a certain fact properly, right? Or just don't have evidence for a certain thing, right? But yeah. Okay, let's swap back. 1 second. Okay. There we go.
Business interest. No, this is what, like, how can I trust your opinion on whether or not Norway or other social democracies engage in neocolonialism when you're not willing to admit that the IMF and the World Bank do exactly that? Like, it'd be like me trying to talk to somebody about, like, sexual assault, and then they're like, dude, it's not like rapey if, like, you know, she's drunk. Like your way of perceiving, your way of perceiving, like, the fault that I'm trying to look at here is totally different from mine. Like, I think, like, we have very different preconceptions when it comes to stuff like this, right?
Well, sure, but it's important to recognize those preconceptions, and I'm recognizing without a doubt that the IMF is not perfect. There's a lot of criticisms for the IMF to be had. Arguably, it shouldn't exist as an institution, and that they've done arguably more bad than good, some good, maybe not more than bad. So I'm making all those concessions in my analysis. I'm really what I'm arguing against is the idea that the IMF is focused on regime change, incredible neocolonialism, when really the way that I view it is the IMF is a bank, similar to how, like you mentioned, the Belt and Road Initiative for China. Something that they're concerned with, of course, is their lending arrangements that include being paid back. This is why they get in all that trouble with, you hear about the Sri Lankan case with the Chinese lending, because Sri Lanka wasn't able to pay back Chinese loans, and that's why China gets a lot of the same criticism the IMF does, because right now, China is trying to get money from Sri Lanka, even though it's a heavily indebted nation. I mean, that's the main point. It's a good faith argument. I'm not trying to be dishonest.
No, I know. Just, can I read this blurb from the Wikipedia? From the 1950s outward, the United States doled out loans to third world nations, now referred to as least developed countries. The U.S. encouraged neoclassical and free market economics and LDCs for two reasons. One, countering the spread of socialist ideology during the Cold War, and two, as a means of accumulating wealth by means of foreign direct investment as well as interest on the loans. The immediate and stated and clear goals from the beginning of this organization, with regards to the structural adjustment policies we've talked about, were explicitly about maintaining ideological hegemony and by accumulating wealth. Nothing here, their stated goals were not helping the third world. When the fuck have we ever cared about helping the third world? When the fuck, when has the West ever given a single shit about the development of those countries? We spit on them. We only care about their development insofar as it's beneficial to our economy. In particular, Western companies sought to gain access to raw commodities, especially minerals and agricultural products.
Where are you reading from?
Wikipedia. History, wiki, structural adjustment, hashtag criticisms. This is under the IMF article.
Okay, gotcha. Go on.
Yeah. In particular, Western companies sought to gain access to raw commodities, especially minerals and agricultural products, often in exchange for capital or large-scale infrastructural projects. After the run on the dollar of the 1980s, the United States adjusted its monetary policy and instituted other measures so it could begin competing aggressively for capital on a global scale. This was successful, as it can be seen from the current account of the country's balance of payments. Enormous capital flows to the United States had the corollary of dramatically depleting the availability.
I feel like the history stuff is kind of like, didn't Econoboi already like agree that, hey, you know, maybe in the past it was like this? So I don't know how. I guess this is kind of more recent history, so maybe it's okay.
Of capital to poor and middling countries. Giovanni Arrighi has observed this scarcity of capital, which was heralded by the Mexican default of 1982. Quote, created a propitious environment for the counter-revolution of developmental thought and practice that the neoliberal Washington consensus began advocating at about the same time. Taking advantage of the financial straits of many low and middle income countries, the agencies of the consensus foisted them measures of structural adjustment.
It's just like reading like an out. Like, why is he reading so much? Just like comprehend and like read the important parts.
Their position in the global hierarchy of wealth, but greatly facilitated the redirection of everything. Like, this is the
Okay, now I understand why
this is what the
part
earth
wasn't
does.
like
We don't
that
care about the developing world. We care about them only insofar as we invest in them.
Right. Well, sure. I guess, again, I think we're going to have to agree to disagree to a certain extent. I don't think that there have certainly been a lot of development programs that the U.S. and the global North broadly have contributed to in terms of trying to build out, either the resource wealth or just the institutions of other nations.
Why would we help them for their sake?
Well, I mean,
why do we care?
What do you mean? Well, it's sort of like saying, why do we have welfare programs, right? I mean, to a certain extent, we do want to provide aid
to keep our population from revolting. Why would we help them? We even did the Marshall Plan just to keep.
I mean, this is now I feel like everybody just has to go back like one more step, right? Like, basically the difference is Vaush has like this very sort of practical power focus like thing, which is very Marxist of him, to be fair. But I think Econoboi is more of like a liberal, and liberals generally talk about the importance of ideas. So like, it's not just what incentives do people have, it's also like what ideas they have, right? So both perspectives have value, I think. But I think like, especially the idea of like only power matters really misses out on a lot of like what I think are realities of, you know, of the system. Yeah. Or it has to like contort to like understand why like certain things happen. But yeah,
communist ideology from spreading in Europe. Like, everything we do has a price tag attached to it. Why would we do something for other countries just like to help them out?
Well, I mean, again, you can ultimately reduce every single thing down to like sort of an amoral type egoist sort of, oh, we always do everything ultimately to help ourselves. I mean, maybe that's right. I'm not really sure, but the point is that that's true for every other country too. I mean, when you talk about China, the reason they engaged in the Belt and Road Initiative in the first place was because they want to develop export markets for themselves so that they can diversify away from the global north broadly,
Yes.
because they don't. Right, because
Yeah,
they
they're
don't
doing
want
the
to be
same
reliant.
thing, and they're also a capitalist country that invests in the third world so they could steal money from them. Yeah.
Well, right, but I guess it gets confusing when you said that China just does it better than us. Like, I guess.
Oh, sorry, they're
Well,
more
I don't.
effective than us because they aren't limited by the democratic process. They're much more aggressive in their investment. Whereas any investment the U.S. did, it has to be done through subsidiaries like the IMF or World Bank because U.S. citizens would never consent to having money spent on investments in developing countries because we hate them. If Americans
Well,
were
the
smart
yeah,
and
sure.
self-interested, we would be okay with a few percentage points of our GDP more going to developing nations because we could invest in them and fuck their economies to our benefit. But Americans are so stupid and so despicably hateful towards the rest of the world that they can't even understand the basic principles of neocolonialism. We would rather have our money spent on the military than towards the actual mechanisms that actually lead to the control of the world. China is not a democracy, so their leaders are free to use their money to invest in other countries and exploit them in the ways that we can only do through the IMF and World Bank.
Well, sure. I think, well, again, to be fair, I think one of the things that actually I think happened under the Trump administration was a
But
international.
hey, he's admitting that what the Americans believe matters. So at least that's there, you know. But yeah, I understand why this part is bad. How much? Oh, it's okay. It's on.
Infrastructure Development Bank, which was U.S. control, not just the IMF and
Discount.
the World Bank. Obviously, you could have
Yeah.
the same criticisms for those institutions. I think overall, we again, we're gonna have to agree to disagree on the IMF necessarily. I think my final point on the IMF would just be that I view the IMF more as a bank rather than a force of regime change. I think that a lot of the negatives of the IMF are better explained by that mindset than your mindset, and I think the criticism is more palpable with my mindset than yours. But would you mind if I move on? That was actually your first point. There's a
Yeah,
second
we
point you
got
made
kind
that
of on a tangent there. Yeah, we can move
You're
on
good.
because I don't have too much time. We got kind of we'll be more productive the next one. Yeah, maybe.
Sure, no worries. Sure.
Fingers
So you said your
crossed.
second point was you're not convinced by GDP accounting in general, and it seemed that you gave the example of if you stop taking vitamin A, that's only like 5% of your vitamin intake, but you really need vitamin A in your body, right? Or you'll die without it, or something bad will happen. Not a doctor. And you use that as an example of like, well, how much of our GDP is based on rare earth elements, and if we stop getting those or lithium, the economy would be structurally very very unsound because we need those. So and you also mentioned that the U.S. economy is mostly services, and services
Oh, yeah.
require physical goods,
Okay.
which are very necessary. So so some things to say on these points, and I think the point I'm going to make is applicable to all your points. So
Yeah,
it is true, obviously,
that's
that
cliche.
you
Thank
need
you.
sort of these primary inputs
Yeah.
for a lot of the
Wait,
production of
one
the economy.
second. Okay, yeah, like I tried like the dead on sort of view, and it looks like bad, so I kind of kept a sideways view. And yeah, I mean, no green screen just because my dorm doesn't have the space, but yeah. Like the dead on view just looks like really flat. And normally when I'm looking at other streamers like Vaush here, he's like, it's like sideways, right? So I thought, hey, let's just copy them, right? So I guess it's cliche in some ways, but yeah.
You need iron for steel, you need steel for building, and you need buildings to house all those white collar workers or whatever for the services they provide. That's all true. But I think that number one, you're assuming again that what I'm advocating for, or what the sort of world I see is a more sort of autarky style world where people are more closed off. Really, what I'm advocating for is the opposite, to become even more open and globalized. And what I would say is that unequal exchange, which is just the idea that workers in the global south would be raised to a living standard at least equitable to their productive capacity.
Oh my God, like Econoboi just should have never mentioned this like study. Like it just went off into like some crazy shit. He should have just talked about like the comparative advantage and whatnot instead of talking about all this GDP stuff. Like unless like, because the problem is for this thing you kind of have to like explain that background before you get into the study. Otherwise it's just like, oh, can they close themselves off or not, and it's like there's an argument about that which isn't like super helpful. But yeah,
wouldn't necessarily shut off trade. It wouldn't mean that we wouldn't have access to those resources.
Why would
But
we
what
do
I
that,
would
though?
say, so I think the first point that I made was, it was literally the first point I made in this debate, was the idea that investors across time have become a lot more sort of socially conscious. It's called ESG investing. I'm sure you're aware. Environmental, social, and government style investing.
this type of investing is actually like pretty cool. Like it's basically just you. Okay, I guess he's explaining, but like just investing depending on with like a mind for social consciousness. So not investing in like bad companies which cause like social harm and things like that.
And just the idea would be that across time, it seems that shareholders and investors are becoming more and more socially conscious and more aware of the impacts that they have that trickle out outside the realm of just their corporate doors and their profit margins.
How would they
Yeah, so now basically the issue is now that Vaush doesn't like care about the ideas thing, right? He's just focused on like, hey, these are the incentives. I don't care like what the ideas are. all that stuff is just temporary, will change day to day, basically. So it's a very materialist sort of approach, whereas Econoboi isn't necessarily taking that materialist approach. He's kind of looking more at like the ideas and saying like, hey, this idea might cause like, so it seems to be growing over time and things like that. So I think that's just like a fundamental sort of disagreement with their worldviews, basically.
Changing.
Well, so for instance, the phenomenon of ESG investing has become a big thing. For instance, Chase just released a guideline for their portfolio of lending, which showed that they actually have actual renewable energy mandates in their portfolio that, well, not renewable, but like carbon sequestration or carbon reduction mandates in their portfolio, which is to say that Chase said, if you don't reduce your carbon footprint by this amount in a weighted average sense of who we lend to, we will not lend to you anymore. You'll have a great restriction in how much we lend to you. That's Chase Bank.
Is it
right?
a meaningful restriction?
Bro, like, okay, I mean, like, okay, so we'll see how this goes, but I feel like it's just gonna be, I need a better example. Right? For each thing, which is kind of, like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, whatever. So, like, basically, for Vaush, the only proof which would like just prove that, hey, capitalists, like people or capitalist firms are reducing, or sorry, are changing based on some idea, is the firms actually have to like take a hit based on that idea, right? And like that can be like that's an understandable sort of perspective, but I think like just based on how capitalism works, it's not that it doesn't really work that way. Like if the firm just starts taking a hit to their profits, the investors will stop investing in them and will invest in like alternative firms which don't, right? And any good that they were trying to do is like wiped out pretty much instantly, right? So like I don't think you can like show it like that, right? But
I want to say, so they delineate their emissions into quote scope 1, 2, and 3. I think scope 3 is like methane, scope 1 is like carbon. I don't know what scope 2 is. And the cuts are essentially the goal would be net zero 2050, which is kind of what the what the climate industry has, not climate industry, sounds conspiratorial, world. That's essentially what scientists have said is sort of the deadline to become net zero. And so you see a lot of banks and a lot of corporations taking on net zero pledges, even though it's probably more profitable not to do it.
Well, I've been seeing companies take net zero pledges for a long time now, and I've been seeing very few net zero companies. It seems to me like this is just another way for companies. And
is that true? Like, are there like very few net zero companies? I mean, like, sure, it hasn't really happened that much, but it's kind of like interconnected, right? So it's not very easy to say, hey, I'm gonna become net zero. But wait, let me check. Net zero companies. Which companies are net zero? Which companies are net zero? A fifth of the this is committed. Okay. I'm pretty sure like some big tech companies are like net zero, right? Like Microsoft or something. But yeah, let me check. Let's just watch the video. I switched because I think like my
investors to
recommended is like
spritz up to sort of hand wave, what would you call, whitewash the harm they do, like when GM had that green logo. I mean, I want to know, like, is this pledge even legally binding, or is this just some big virtue signal they're trying to throw out there to lessen the extent of Washington regulations on climate change, because they're hoping to convince Washington and voters that conscientious companies are doing enough? I mean, because like that's always how it's been, right? Every time companies actually have to take a profit hit in order to make the world a better place, they have to be regulated into doing it. They never voluntarily do it. They lie about voluntarily doing it, or they'll try to trick the public. Clean coal, you remember that? I mean, Christ, we've seen this for decades. It's good marketing, but it doesn't change anything. I would need to see real actionable change being done here. How long of a deadline do we have? Like, how long before I see?
I think this is understandable. Like, I think the idea that like I think the thing is just like it's possible to take action in ways which aren't like impacting profit up or down. And that's kind of the only thing like people can do when they're in like big companies, right? They can't like because at the end of the day they're reliant on their investors. And yeah, so like yeah, it's difficult for sure. Like it seems like the things they're doing, like this Chase and whatever, there has to be like a sorry, that was a bit too loud. There has to be like a a profitable sort of motive for it as well, because otherwise, one, they might not be able to justify it, and two, like if their profits are just cutting because they're doing all this stuff, they're just not, their company is going to die, right? But
Will Chase actually stop loaning out to a company because they're not meeting those goals? I bet you I never will.
Sure. So I've got the pledge right here. In terms of oil and gas, they'd have to reduce emissions by 35% by 2030, for instance. So I think it's a fairly sizable reduction in carbon emissions,
If
at
it
least in the
happens,
next 9 years.
Am I supposed to
No, I
suck them
understand,
off
but
for
you,
the next 9 years because they said they do?
no,
it?
no.
Look, I fucked girls with
Well, Vaush,
virginity
I'm not
pledges.
saying.
All right, I'm just saying. People are
Well, yeah,
shiftless. You know, it's
yes. We've all heard of and or seen the promise ring laid on the nightstand, metaphorically, we could say. So what I was going to say is that, of course, it's the case that you said, are these like legally binding? Of course, Chase doesn't. It's a corporation, obviously. So there's no like law or anything like that. It's just a commitment to say that if you don't reduce your emissions by this date, we will stop lending to you, which I think is a fairly reasonable mandate. Of course, you asked the question.
I mean, like obviously we can't look at if something's legally binding. Like obviously a corporation can't make it legally binding by themselves, right? But yeah, I mean, yep. I feel like it's kind of like an impossible sort of example of what I was looking for here. I mean, there will be, but not like from big companies, because then they wouldn't be big. But yeah.
Maybe the thought that well, we don't see a lot of carbon neutral companies today. Well, again, these are pledges in the future to align with what the scientific consensus is on climate change and warming. So of course, if the goal is in 2050.
There are things they could do right now to lower their emissions if they wanted to take a cut to their profits. Why is it always in the future? If they really cared, wouldn't they do it like right now rather than deferring it to some point in the future?
Again, companies are taking those pledges. I talked about the boom of ESG investing.
What about the actual the changes, though?
Well, when I say taking those pledges, what I should have said is enacting those pledges to a certain extent. I talk about the boom of ESG investing that's coming online right now, and so companies are currently making strides right now to try and reduce their emissions and try and enact that. Which is just to say that it is an example of a company.
I mean, like if ESG investing is happening, then it's worth it to reduce it a bit. And like the impact of that is companies trying to reduce their emissions so they can get into these ESG like people's portfolios and whatnot. But yeah,
is not organically, to be fair. People want this, investors want this, to be more green despite it potentially hitting their profit margins. And I've already, again, in the first part of this conversation, I mentioned examples of countries that have taken steps to limit their supply chain, including things like slave labor or child labor, despite the fact that it might hurt businesses. So if we're moving to a more sort of if we're moving to a more sort of practical argument, I think that practically it would be possible, and it's been seen, and it's currently being seen right now.
Can you name like a major company that's taken a hit, that whose shareholders have taken a hit because with no regulation pressuring them to, they've cut back on their carbon emissions?
So you're asking, if I understand the question, you are asking, name a company that is currently net zero or has significantly reduced their sort of contribution to human suffering.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, like they've really like cut back on this, or like any other big socially conscientious thing that led to like a significant hit to their worth as a company, you know? Because if they're doing it only in ways that don't hurt the net worth of their company, I don't care about that. If their investors can look at the numbers and find out that it's not a hurt to them to make these changes, that's great and all, but that doesn't solve the problem, because it will be a hurt to these companies to stop relying on unequal exploitation of the developing world, guaranteed. So I need to see they're willing to take that hit, you know?
Yeah, so this problem is kind of there in that, like okay, so I'm pretty sure Econoboi like would like agree that like, you know, these companies of their own volition aren't going to like induce a recession because they want like equitable global markets, right? They're not, right? But I think like Econoboi thinks that it'll be like government essentially doing that part. But this second thing is just I'm not really sure why he's bringing up this, but the second thing seems to be kind of more about hey, you know, there is some like there are like ideological movements in capitalism and changes, right? And this can influence democracy and things like that. But I think Vaush is under the opinion that like corporations will just like control democracy or something, probably. I know that's like the Marxist view. I don't know if like that's his view, but yeah. So
sure.
Again, speaking past each other a little bit, but I feel like every debate is speaking past to each other a little bit because there's always those fundamental differences, and it's so difficult to like actually discuss those because you need to like really like understand them and really understand how you can like debate them, right? And I don't know how to do that either, but yeah. That's why I always just talk about the different opinions, because I think it's like helpful to understand like the different perspectives so you can form your own better, right? I'm not like super interested in kind of telling you what's right or wrong, or which perspective is right or wrong. I'm kind of just more interested in showing you like this like there's this perspective and that perspective. You need to like you can like figure out what works for you, right? Or if some combination works, right?
So it's a question that I'm not sure is possible to ask or to answer. So, and the reason I would say that is because obviously, if investors want them to do these things and they do these things, well, there's no necessary reason why stock values would take a big hit because that's what shareholders are asking for. They're going to keep their stock, right? Now,
Their profit will be lower.
Well, sure, but I'm saying that if nobody sells their stock, even if profits go lower, you don't end up with lower stock value because obviously stock value is just based on supply and demand of stock. So it's unfortunately it's a question that's difficult to engage in. But
yeah, like the profits going lower, I don't know, like I don't know if most shareholders are like holding the stock for the dividends from the profits. I think it's like maybe the really big ones might, but like I think it's generally more to do with okay, I think the stock is going to go up or down. Like that's like where the big money is to be made, right? Not to say these profits are also like really big, but I'm pretty sure that's the case, right?
But I think a question that I would pose is, what is generally your point, right? What is your point regarding getting rid of unequal exchange? Would the idea just be that companies won't allow it and to lobby governments to prevent it from happening, or what does the broader point look like?
Yeah, that's been happening for decades. Why?
Okay, so so basically what I said, where like he thinks that like companies will essentially control democracy to get what they want, right? I think I'm unconsciously speaking faster because like I put this on like 1.5 times speed.
Why would they ever want? Why would investors in the West?
Okay, I'm becoming a debate, bro.
Ever want changes to happen that would make them less money? My entire life, and for the life of my father and his father before him, and going back a while, all they've ever done is do things that make them money. That's all they can do. There aren't really historical examples of people going against this trend. Sometimes the people in a country, in a democracy, fight and they fight and they fight, and they get regulations put through, you know? But every time the industries fight against it. When there were no regulations on like diesel or gasoline that choked the air of New York City back in 1927, it was not the goodwill of companies that led them to regulate like the manufacturing of gas. People protested, and Washington forced those regulations. When it came to cigarettes and the carcinogens within them, they lied for decades about it. When climate change was known back in the 1960s, the oil and gas companies lied about it for decades despite having unfalsifiable evidence that it was the case. Your idea is that we can somehow overwrite this near ubiquitous trend of economic interests playing out with no concern to externalities, which is in this case
like okay. I think Econoboi. Okay, so he's like knowledgeable and all, but he's not good at making his points. He's not like as rhetorically effective as Vaush, that's for sure. But like I think what he's trying to argue is mainly about this like ESG trend. Like the ESG trend, like by definition, will make sustainable like companies and companies trying to reduce their carbon. Dude, this thing is shaking too much. Yeah, companies trying to reduce their carbon emissions more profitable, and more encouraged, like by definition, because more people are investing in that area, right? Or not profitable, I should say. I should say like just there's more investment and stock prices will increase and things like that for those companies, and it'll go down for companies who are like really bad at these things. But yeah,
it's the third world, you know.
Sure.
Without like hurting its bottom line, but that just never happens. They always promote their interests above everyone else's.
Well, sure. So I may have misunderstood the initial question. So when you asked why would they sort of get rid of unequal exchange, I thought you were talking about more on the company side. Now, obviously, the government regulation plays a big role in pushing sustainability and things like that. I think you've got a bit of a contradictory narrative where sort of on one hand, you've got companies that are lobbying government, preventing all this good action from happening, but then we do see a lot of environmental regulations and we do see a lot of sort of sustainability pushes and investment in. Well, I mean, the entirety of the EPA and everything that they do. I mean, take the Clean Air Act that reduced emissions or sort of air pollutants significantly in the United States, right? I mean, you might argue that like the coal lobby or whoever, lobbied against that or something, but it ended up getting passed. I think it was the Carter administration.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of them got undone or weakened by future presidents. That's the thing, right?
Well,
companies can pollute the ground, the water, and the air, and you can get people real outraged. And that outrage might lead to change in Washington. But how long before the people forget? You have clean air and water for long enough, and people start to forget. Public interest drops off. You know whose interest never drops off? Shareholders. Because while the public may have fought for X or Y 30 or 40 years ago, eventually they'll get old and die, and a new generation will be voting. And who's still there waiting for those people to forget? It's lobbyists. And they talk to the government, and they say, hey, honest to God, I don't think people care much anymore. Reduce this regulation, packages it as part of a debureaucratization program. Say that it's investing in business, say that it'll increase the GDP. And then they go ahead and do it. All these regulations got whittled down. We saw this with tax rates and we saw this with everything. There was basically no regulatory element to the United States.
This is a strong rhetorical point, at least. I mean, I think like it's related to the argument, but I don't think we can say like even if we have paint time, even if we have regular if even if we have like regulations coming and going, it's pretty clear that over time, like, government regulations and stuff have improved, right? So even if we have like this sort of cycle or whatever, oh, this looks like the boom bust cycle. Like it's pretty clear that like it's still increasing and improving over time, right? Like I don't think we can say like all regulations that we're doing is just going to be like halted by some company. Like that's clearly not true, right? There's plenty of regulation which has happened, which just isn't being undone, right? So as to why that is, you know, you can argue, oh, you know, these are things which people will really notice if it's changed. So like, you know, things like workplace safety measures or something like that, right? Or you could argue like, hey, you know, governments have changed. Nobody believes in these ideas anymore, right? Nobody believes that like child labor should be a thing, right? Well, most people don't. But yeah, so I think like it's just like I don't know how true that is necessarily, right? But let's see what happens. Oh shit.
that has not been whittled away at with time. Corporations have an interest and an incentive to be permanently politically engaged. The people only react to what they can see and feel, and they will never see or feel what's happening in the third world. We spend billions of dollars promoting a completely insular media space where we are utterly...
Yeah, so now that like he's got this going, he's just bringing everything together, right?
removed from the consequences of our economy to the rest of the world.
So I think it seems like your narrative would imply that environmental regulations are strongest when they were originally proposed and passed. And I don't think that anyone would say that the EPA, when originally conceived under Nixon or under the Clean Air Act when Carter passed it, is the time in which the United States had the most environmental and most robust regulations, right? Of course, these regulations...
Chipped away at with
Sure,
time.
go on.
They get chipped away at with time.
No, but well, sure, but that again, that implies that as it's chipped away, it does not become more than what it originally was, right? And so I don't think that anyone in business or anyone in sort of common parlance would say that environmental regulations are have only ever gotten worse since the EPA in the United States.
I'm not saying they can only get worse. Public interest can fuel more climate change or regulatory laws, but eventually they do get whittled away. Like pretty much every major environmental regulation that has been passed more than 10 years ago has at least seen some kind of compromise thrown its way, has it not?
No, not really. I mean, like I think maybe as one example, for instance, okay, something that the Trump administration actually did. It was December.
The faces are everywhere, dude. Like, I mean, I understand. Like, I don't know. I feel like maybe I just don't see my own face when I'm like talking or something. But I feel like I would never like make these faces like when I'm talking with someone, right? Like why would you like if someone is debating you, like. I mean, I guess like it's a good in like performative sense because like what is this guy doing? Oh my god, he's so wacky, right? But like in terms of like having a good conversation, like you never want to, you know, look like you're like not taking the point seriously, right? Or not listening properly, right? Yeah, it's kind of weird, for sure. I think that generally. It's just one of those places where it's pretty obvious that like the existence of an audience harms the quality of the discourse, right?
For 2020, like right before they left kicking and streaming, I should say, they passed a new tax credit for carbon capture. Right now, obviously, if you know, there's no reason for them to incentivize something like that if they're just sort of in the pocket of the oil lobby. Obviously, we're talking about the Trump administration, for God's sake. So, you know, I think that that is but one example.
Wait, do you not think the Trump administration was in the pocket of the oil companies?
No, I'm not asking you necessarily to engage in that specific example. My point is that indeed Trump was a very much more pro-oil president than Obama or than Biden is currently. My point is just to say that the narrative, and I think I'm not going to suggest what you say obviously on your platform, but I think that in general, the narrative that environmental regulations only get chipped away and the only time that they're built up is as a result of some sort of voter outrage. It might be true in large part.
It can be scrutinized due to VODs. Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, they're more... That's true. They're more open to criticism, so they definitely want to look good to their audience. I mean, they just always want to look good to their audience because that's how they, you know, get the cash. And also, like, I mean, like, people stream because they want the audience to like them, right? Yeah, they're not. Most people aren't like interested in having good conversations with the other people, right? But yeah. And also, it's just more entertaining if you see people making faces and stuff. If someone's like just looking like in a listening sort of a face, it's not really as interesting. But yeah.
But I do think that right now, again, with the boom of ESG investing, with shareholders trying to make more sort of actions in sustainability and diversity and good governance and things like that, I do think you start to see that a little bit more organically. And to bring it, last sentence that I'd say is that to bring it around to the original discussion on unequal exchange, I think that there is a place for government regulation, and I don't think that even if you could say that companies won't do this organically, I'm not sure, but I do think there's a place for government regulation, and I'm not sure that it's bore out in a modern context that governments are unwilling to regulate that kind of thing.
Okay, so a few things. First of all, I don't think Donald Trump passing tax credits for carbon capture really counts, because if he really cared, he would punish companies who push out carbon, not reward companies who don't. All carbon capture
reward companies who capture carbon, obviously.
All tax credits do, even if they're incentivized through carbon capture, is give more money to businesses, which is consistent with his entire policy platform. This doesn't hurt companies who continue the status quo when it comes to carbon production at all. It's just tax credits.
It does though. It's opportunity cost, right? I mean, obviously, if you're
it doesn't hurt the existing companies. They're not affected. All this.
Okay, opportunity cost is important for multiple reasons. One is like, it does hurt the companies because now suddenly all these other companies which are doing carbon capture are, you know, making more money, right? Like, so investors might shift, right? Things like that. Like okay, so obviously, like in terms of just strict numbers, they're not losing money. The other places people are gaining money, but like that's just such like a one-dimensional view, I guess.
All this really is like, you can get some tax credits if you capture carbon dioxide. This isn't a meaningful way of pushing people. If listen, incentives are about the carrot and the stick, okay? And this is a weak carrot and a non-existent stick. I feel like you keep avoiding my general point in favor of snipping out like little exceptions. The general trend when it comes to environmental regulations is that you see a surge of their promotion, but you see them whittled away with time. Not all of them ubiquitously. I'm not saying that the maximum environmental regulation we had was right when the EPA was formed. I'm only saying that as a trend, this is something that the public is not great at monitoring perfectly because it requires a near perfect level of continuous information on subjects that require a lot of expertise, whereas corporations do. Corporations do have a constant and perfect understanding of the political situation with regards to environmental regulation. There are people paid 7 figures to do exactly that. So not only do they have a material interest, they also have the means and the knowledge necessary to affect those changes. I need to see some evidence of American corporations, of the modern economic system, meaningfully and willingly limiting its economic output for humanitarian reasons, because I can't think of any. Governments will sometimes do stuff like this with public outrage, but there is no public outrage for what American businesses do in foreign countries. Nobody cares. Coca-Cola was funding death squads and nobody gave a shit. It was a lefty meme on Twitter for like 3 months. That's it. Americans have been taught not to care. We do not get taught about foreign countries. We do not learn about their leaders, their languages, their struggles, and we certainly do not learn where they get their money from. This is a deliberate, not on every level, not every teacher, but broadly, a deliberate product of a political...
Okay. Okay, so this is a little complicated because let's say, okay, so corporations are made up of people, right? We all agree on that. Hopefully, right? Hopefully we agree that, you know, people who run corporations are still people, right? But generally speaking, if the public thinks that something is, you know, good or bad, that knowledge will also like come to those people, right? Like so it kind of comes hand in hand a little bit. Like obviously there are exceptions like the death squad stuff and things like that. But like generally speaking, like especially with something like environmental regulations, right? At the end of the day, like it's not just corporations are looking at what people do and are adjusting their behavior accordingly. It's also, hey, corporations are made of people, and no, okay, it's also, hey, corporations are made of people, and you know, these are some of the same people who will be influenced by whatever trends and whatnot, right? Or investors, for example, like, you know, climate change is becoming more and more of a significant issue, right? And ESG investing is growing, right? For example, what are you responding no to?
And economic isolationism that allows us to enjoy quite a bit at the world's expense. It's not like we've only done this recently and that we only do it economically. We do it in a bunch of ways. We've done it historically when it comes to the plight of the Orient, the foreign world, what we did and what we took from them. It's exactly what empires did back during the old colonial days when we literally sent soldiers abroad to go steal vases and portraits. This is a continuation of a long-standing historical trend. All we've done is anonymize and abstracted it. And unfortunately, I think in a way you're being an avatar of that like colonial force, because you're arguing in essence, I mean, I'm sorry, but you came here straight-facedly to argue that investors are going to be more green and more ethical in the future, so we should trust them to like make these changes and
That's not
take
at
a
all
price
what I'm
hit.
arguing,
No,
to be
you,
fair.
you did. I was like, they're not going to
Nope.
take a price hit if it means
Didn't
humanitarian.
say we should trust them, though. Didn't
Well,
say we should trust
then
them.
what were
Just
you
try to point to a
implying?
general trend. No, so you asked, you again,
Yeah,
it's my
so like, yeah, companies are made of. Oh, okay. But okay, so I think one problem is that there are, this is a problem that a lot of people have, or strangely, it's like a lot of people, they'll talk about these facts, right? And they won't necessarily be aware of like the normative sort of, or like the should statement, which is kind of connecting these facts, right? So like if I say, for example, if I talk about all these facts about why police are bad, right? Like, and you say, oh, so do you think we should like get rid of police? And I say, no, like, I'm not arguing that, right? It kind of falls flat because like, why are you mentioning all these facts, right? You have to give some other reason, right? And like there was a reason in his argument, right? But the problem is like he didn't really make that connection, which is why it's which is why this confusion is coming up. Wait, let me switch.
a misunderstanding of the question, but you asked why would they do it, and so I point to the trends in ESG investing that are organic, that companies are engaging these pledges.
Pledges.
You know, you could say,
why not now? You can
no,
do it now. They could do
God
it
sakes,
right
Vaush.
now.
No, but okay. Well, Vaush, I'm not sure what you mean they could do it right now. Again, I've already conceded that if we were to get rid of unequal exchange tomorrow, we would in fact see a recession and see that happening. My only argument is that it could be reformed over time, which you agreed with. To be fair, we're just having a more practical argument right now. So that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying you should trust companies just take care of it themselves. I'm not a libertarian or an ANCAP or anything like that. It's just to say that I do think there is an organic movement that can be part of the mix of that movement and also government regulations that ultimately lead to unequal exchange being eliminated to some degree, right? That you can see worker parity across the world. Now, to be fair, I'll say the exact same thing that you said about socialism, is that you said you don't see a socialist revolution happening anytime soon, and I don't see what I'm describing happening necessarily anytime soon either. I just think that it's possible, and I think that we do see trends towards that direction.
I mean, if the trend is corporations taking virtue signaling pledges and not actually doing anything, then I guess, yeah, they've been doing that for a while. Like that's just like a big PR move. But
okay, didn't they already like talk about that part? But okay, I mean that's the game.
Never in the history of the market economy can I think of an example of a major corporation for humanitarian reasons like limiting the stock price and the profitability of their company. I can't think of it, and I can't think of the U.S.
Well,
the United States ever
do you-
engaging in humanitarian investment abroad or
do you think
regulating
companies-
stuff like that for no reason.
Do you think companies today engage in no social spending or like charity at all? I mean,
Charities are tax loopholes.
Charities and taxes is I feel like they're okay. Let's just continue.
Wealthy people. Wait. No. Companies.
Come on.
Wait. Do you not know how charities work in the context of a lot of these like things? The reason charities can incentivize certain forms of investment. They're good for PR, and they mean that you can qualify for some other stuff. No, companies don't generally like they don't have meetings where they like go to like stockholders and go like, oh well, I know you guys all wanted your prices to be X this year, but you know if we're gonna like actually just give a bunch of money to charity. Charity is usually just another.
He's talking about how like ridiculous that sounds, and simultaneously kind of saying they should do stuff like that, right? Or like okay. Okay.
Component. The tax laws for charity in the United States are sometimes very beneficial to corporations. Now, I'm not familiar with all of the specifics on that, but I do know that there have been like write-ups about it and the ways that they can use it to avoid some other potential economic problems. Like I can research it next stream, so I have a more particular understanding of the issue.
Yeah, no worries. I think obviously that would be very educational for the stream and everyone. But my point was to say that obviously charities do engage in a decent enough amount of sort of charity and social outreach right now. But obviously it's the case that those are deducted from their taxes, but you're not getting like the value of that tax deduction is only the tax rate times the spending. You're not getting the full amount of spending back, and you're still spending more. No, hold on. To be fair, again, there are tax loopholes regarding charity, but I don't think it's the case that the overwhelming amounts or even some, even or certainly all of charity spending is just some crazy tax loophole by corporations. And the only reason I bring that up is because you brought, can you name even a single example of companies sort of spending more money than they otherwise would need to on societal benefit or at the detriment of their share price? And by that I mean obviously cash flow return to shareholders. Well, obviously, when share price in theory and typically in practice is the idea of future expected return in the form of cash flow, and when you're decreasing that amount in the form of charitable givings, well, yes, you would necessarily be decreasing the amount that your stock would be worth. Right now, that's all I'm saying. It's not a controversial claim to say that there's more than even a single example of companies engaging in charitable giving at the detriment of their free cash flow. Obviously, the money has to come from somewhere, and that's all I'm saying. I think that your absolute position is necessarily it's got to be necessarily incorrect, and you've got to see where I'm coming from with that, right?
Well, no, not even slightly.
So you think no? You think no?
So this is like part of the reason why it's like such a flexible model, right? Like it's unless companies are literally shooting themselves in the foot and dying like in like 10 days later, like they're not like this. Nothing else can be a example, right? Everything else is explained by profits and stuff, right? Like, okay.
Engages
if we're
in-
talking about like chump
Sure.
change, like if you take a look at major mega corporations and you take a look at the amount that they donate to charity, the idea that this in any way transposes onto like them being willing to incur like massive hits to their profitability,
No,
for
but hold on.
humanitarian
Let me
reasons.
let me stop you right there, because that is not my point. My point isn't that companies would be willing to engage in, quote, massive hits to their profitability in the name of sort of social giving or charity. My point is that they would engage in minor hits to their profitability. And when we're talking about economic wide scales, unequal exchange is just not a big part of the economy, and it is not
It
unreasonable to
absolutely
assume
is.
3% is not a big part.
Look,
right?
I've been really nice to you, but I can't let this slide. Okay, it's 3%
Yeah,
at
go
the
for it.
at the cost.
Okay. I find it funny. Like the standard for niceness is completely different. Like, I think, in my opinion, he's like so pissed off.
We pay for their goods, which are undervalued because they're being assembled by sweatshop workers instead of United States citizens. And our manufacturing and industry economy GDP percentage is around 18%. 3% out of 18% is 1 out of 6, or around 17% in total. But it's worse than that. It's not just the industry that we receive and the physical goods that we receive directly. If you talk about the undercosting, it's possible that the imports that we get could contribute to a significant portion, not only of our industrial GDP, but also to the services associated with them. All of the electronic goods and raw resources that we get from them for a dollar, like cents off the dollar, we then use 20 times over in our country. You know, you may get oil from another country, but it gets refined and manufactured and sold and bought and used and etc. Lumber, how many times does lumber get transacted once it reaches our borders?
When I say unequal exchange,
insignificant.
when I say unequal exchange, what does that mean to you?
The fact that we rely on the comparative degree of economic underdevelopment in the developing world in order to extract favorable business and trade relations from them.
So it's
I'm pretty sure like unequal exchange doesn't have to be like because of exploitation. Like I'm pretty sure there's like unequal exchange between like developed countries too. Like it's like it can be totally due to like, okay, there's cheaper labor and stuff, but it can also be like, hey, you know, our land or whatever is better suited for certain forms of production, so we have a comparative advantage there, right? But yeah,
a bit more specific than that. So unequal exchange, and I'll say this is just the idea that, say, you know, if an Indian worker can produce like 1 pound of wood an hour or something, and then an American worker can produce 1 pound of wood an hour, theoretically they on an exchange rate should be paid the exact same. But Indian workers are paid less per unit of production than like American workers. As an example, obviously I don't know about the wood industry in India or anything, but that to me is what unequal exchange is. And so when you say, oh, it's only 3% because of the comparatively low living standards that we enforce, the reason I disagree with that is because that unequal exchange is literally taking into account that difference in pay. That if we equalized that difference, if the standard of work and productivity was equal across countries, it is 3% of GDP. It's 3%. That's what it is, and that's a significant portion of the economy if gotten rid of in 1 year.
It's 3% if all the people assembling them were being paid American union wages. No, it's not.
No. It's 3. It's no. Well, that's not what I said though. It's 3% if Indian workers were paid per their productivity, because Indian workers or global South workers broadly are less productive on average.
Wait, if you work in a factory for 8 hours a day, whether you're in the United States or India, what is the paid per productivity for an Indian worker working in a factory? What is
so
that
I think
exactly?
that this is where I'm trying to explain. So this is where I think I could illuminate a little bit more. So the reason that global South workers are less productive on average than like global North workers isn't necessarily because they're like dumber or anything like that, or their hands don't work right or anything. Part of it is lack of educational attainment, sure, that contributes somewhat to productivity, but also part of it is lack of access.
It's a shame that there are international loan sharks who discourage them from spending government money on infrastructure like investment then, huh?
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, I already disagree with that in large part. Obviously, global South nations have, you know, quality universities to go to and everything like that. It's just a matter of overall wealth. What I was trying to say, well, yes, there are quality universities in India. Vaush, come on,
enough for the population. What's the average like educational attainment in India? Do you think it's comparable to the United States? They have like 1.1 billion people. I'm sure they have some.
No, that's part of my point is that on average, Indian workers, and we're using Indian as an example, just global South more broadly workers are less educated, so that contributes part of which to
like Econoboi is kind of like going around in circles a little bit. It's a bit confusing. Yeah,
their productivity that's less, but also part of it is access to capital. So obviously, if you have like the latest and greatest machines available, your workers are going to be per unit more productive than workers that don't have the latest and greatest capital available. So
what's the number?
All I'm saying is the number of what?
What is the productivity of an Indian worker?
What is the productivity of an
explain how it's
Indian
relevant. Obviously,
worker?
I don't know the exact answer to that question.
Everything you're talking about right now is justifying us underpaying them. You know that, right?
No,
you're saying
it's not at all.
Well, no, it is. You're saying essentially that they're impoverished.
As an advocate for getting rid of unequal exchange, I would advocate they should be paid like equal to their productivity. I've got no problem with that. That's been this entire argument that I've had this whole time.
You can't weight their contribution to our GDP based on their perceived productivity if their productivity is already being weighted by the economic conditions that mean they're in the shitter. Well, you're begging the question there. Of course, if you're only paying them or assigning wealth to them based on productivity and their productivity is being lowered dramatically because they're in countries that rely on an unequal exchange, then yeah, but that's like circular logic. Then you could be like, oh, well, why are you only
circular logic? It's like a circular system, right? And he's not trying to say like this is how it should be or whatever. He's just kind of saying like, this is how it is, right? But
buying like a car from India for $1, and you're like, well, over there it's $1 worth of productivity to produce that car, and you're like, okay, how do you figure that? And you're like, well, they're very poor over there. It's like, well, yeah, I know, but like, what's the worth?
Well, I can actually answer this question more specifically, and perhaps this is an answer to your question. So, Jason Hickel, who I'm sure you've heard of, he's basically an advocate that we should get rid of unequal exchange. He's an anthropologist, and what he has found is that even if you were to assume that workers are the same, like let's just say that global South workers and global North workers have the same exact productivity, or like relatively similar productivity, the amount of that unequal exchange would be worth about 6.5% of GDP, right? So, give you an olive branch there, goes from 3 to 6.5%. So, again, I think that even with the most
world?
Yes. So
China
even with the most
alone is $500 billion to the U.S., which is
no, but you're assuming that every single time a good or a service is made in China, it is necessarily completely unequal exchange, and that it's all total exploitation. There's obviously workers in China that are paid reasonably well and are educated reasonably well, right? So that's the problem with that type of analysis.
I think that most of China's industrial export relies on the relationship that they have had historically with the West and their consumption of underpriced goods.
Well, the stat that I quoted, I don't expect you to remember all these stats, obviously. The stat I quoted originally was that as a percentage of the whole entire world's GDP, if you assume every single time someone from the global South makes something, and that is necessarily unequal exchange, it's necessarily exploitative, what is that percentage of the exports that are sort of the world GDP? It's 7.8% of global North GDP, 7.8%. But that's such a crazy assumption to make in the first place. And even if you made that assumption,
why is it a crazy assumption?
7.8%. Well, because number one, China.
Okay, so like it's crazy to assume it's completely unequal exchange for every single like thing. That's kind of what he's trying to say. He's not saying it's like crazy to assume there's unequal exchange, right?
China and the rest of the global South obviously trade a lot with each other, and so if we're concerned mostly with sort of the percentage of the global North GDP, you wouldn't make that assumption. And also just the idea that every single time any worker in China makes a product and then it gets exported to the global North, it's necessarily unequal exchange. It's necessarily incredible, crazy labor exploitation.
China alone, single-handedly, is 20% of our imports. You're telling me that if we axed out the entire global South, it would be charitable to me to say that the global North would lose out on 7% of its GDP? Keep in mind, this GDP is weighted significantly because goods coming from these countries are often underpriced.
Right. So I can answer that question.
Wait, hold on, wait. We've gone over this for a while. This is insanity to me. It's please. There are so many economic assumptions being made here that are wild to me. Like you've essentially circularly justified economic exploitation by saying that the relatively low amount that we pay for the goods that we get from there are a fair cost proportion of the.
Like the thing is, it's not okay. Like I feel like right now Econoboi is mostly just taking a descriptive approach. He's not like trying to justify anything. But anytime it comes to economics, it's always like, this is why, this is that, right? This is like the justification or moralization, right? But that said, I think like it's kind of understandable because like why Vaush would like see it this way, because like Econoboi is like, at least in my opinion, not very good at like explaining. Maybe that's just because I don't have like the economic background, but yeah, I mean most people don't, so.
Degree of inefficiency or underdevelopment or inefficiency that you would get from people in those countries. What we're essentially talking about is, and we're talking about industrial imports too. So keep in mind, most of the United States GDP, 80% of it is like the service economy. About 18% of it is industrial. We don't import the service economy. We import goods.
And it also seems weird. You're not taking into account like the local. I guess if you're trying to talk about it from a sort of, hey, this is justified, this isn't justified sort of perspective, it seems kind of weird to not take into account the different standards of living. But I mean, I guess that's a bit more of a complicated question.
So the goods we import are a significant portion of the raw resources that we use for construction and industry in this country.
That's not true. I've got to stop you there. So a big part of our imports are services. You can import a service as well. And the point that I tried to get in on China is that when you talk about China being 20% of our exports, well, let's just assume that you're right, obviously. Well, if you do that percentage, right? So Chinese exports to GDP as a percentage of our economy, you end up with under 1%, right? And so again, even if you assume, I'm trying to bring it back to the system. Well, because if we import about $800 billion worth of goods, 20% of that's about 200 billion divided by $22 trillion GDP. That's how you might get that number. But that's obviously a rough estimate on the fly. Sure.
No, I don't think. I'm going to be honest with you. Maybe I should have like an economist on or something. The idea to me that you,
yeah, he's throwing shade.
Other people.
Yeah, you got me.
Okay, maybe not one who will say that the IMF is a neutral arbiter. I want to have someone on because I need to know, like, the idea that somebody could straight-facedly look at me and say, like, yeah, dude, if we just cut out all trade from the entire developing world, the parts of the world that we have literally gone to war with and used like third-party organizations to control the economies of so they could be beneficial to our investment, we could cut out all of that and it'd be like a little recession. We had a massive recession from one building having a plane flown into it. I guess two buildings. Like we had more than a 3% GDP dip from the 9/11 attacks. It was a huge dip and it took years to climb back up. And you're telling me that the entire 2/3 of the population, the global south,
I feel like he probably should have just gone more in depth with that paper then, like to explain like, okay, this is why, right? This is like how we figured it out. Because then it would be less like, oh, this is such bullshit, right?
We could just not. And it would be like a temporary reshuffle equivalent to the harm that we experienced to our economy during COVID. That all that, the fact that you can go anywhere in America and buy goods that say made in Taiwan, made in China, whatever, it would just be a little bump. I feel like any reasonable economist would look at that and tell me, because I admit that I'm not like an economist or anything, but I feel like I've made some compelling arguments here. They would look at that and go like, are you fucking crazy? America had an economic harm done just by the tariffs to a couple of industries from China. You think we could cut out all the shit that we get from there? Are you insane? We would collapse. They would collapse. Everything would collapse. Global trade is the only way that we can sustain like fair diplomatic relationships with half these countries anyway. It's probably the only reason why China's not willing to risk war with us over Taiwan, because they know that war, even if it wasn't nuclear.
Now it's going into some other shit. Like he's kind of focusing on this GDP thing, like not because he's advocating for like people to stop trading. Like it's just kind of it's supposed to be more of a way to talk about like, okay, this imbalance like is there and it's possible to fix, basically. Not to say like, okay, it's going to be super easy, but just from like an economic perspective that it's not like inevitable.
It would still lead to a huge recession for both countries. But that wouldn't mean anything, right? If it really was just some flippant little nothing and the West could just trade within the West and it wouldn't be like, we don't actually rely on all this stuff.
So number one, we did not have a 3% recession because of 9/11 at all. Our GDP didn't shrink by 3%. The point that I was making isn't justifying underpaying these global.
It's so funny to watch him like typing, like angrily, like
South workers. But again, I'm making the opposite argument. I feel like you should be more charitable with me in that regard. That we should in fact pay them to the same level of their productivity or to parity completely. Now, my point, bringing up the 6.5%, is that even if we assumed that, despite any knowledge or anything like that, if we assume that they're the same productivity, then the percentage of the economy that's based on exploitation or unequal exchange does go up to 6.5%. And that's not a small, trivial amount of the economy if we wiped it off the map immediately, right? My only point throughout this entire debate, which I feel like is fair enough, is that, in fact, it would be possible to do that it would be sustainable to do that. And we do see countries making steps towards that in that regard. And if we assume a little bit more charitably that there are some productivity differences, it goes down to 3%. So, no reason I don't think we wouldn't have this. And the last thing that I would say is that you say, oh, any economist would say this, and that. Look, forget about the education that I have, consider me an economist or not. But the people I'm citing are economists that are saying these things. The paper about 2 to 8% of GDP, if the U.S. just totally shut off its borders, that was an economist from Berkeley and MIT.
There are other economists who would disagree with that, right? For instance, I find it incredibly telling that none of the numbers you're citing here describe which percentage points that would reduce in the GDP. Because again, if we lost all of our lithium, what is that? A fraction of a percent of our GDP?
No, Vaush, no one's talking about losing. No one's talking about losing all the. Again, the point of the paper about U.S. losing 2 to 8% of GDP is a theoretical construct if we closed our borders completely, right? That's not what I'm advocating for. What I'm advocating for is just simply worker parity across borders, which obviously I think you'd agree with too. My only point is to say that if we did that, that would represent about a 6.5%, being incredibly charitable to productivity, 3 to 6.5% of GDP, and we wouldn't lose all of our lithium, we wouldn't lose all of our wood, our steel. We'd still get these goods. It's just that those workers would be paid a reasonable wage.
I don't believe it. Not for a single, not for a fraction of a second. I think it's actually delusional. I think this is like neoliberal shill shit that people throw out there in an effort to justify the idea.
Jason Hickel is a Marxist, to be fair.
Well, I'd have to take a look at his like readings of this.
So he dropped that at the end.
I don't know if I can trust somebody's interpretation of a Marxist paper when they're like telling me the IMF is like neutral on their shit. I'm sorry. This is no. Like you can laugh, and I'm not trying to be antagonistic or anything like that. But like this,
I'm not laughing at your points. It's just more that obviously I'm being as good faith as possible. Of course, I think I'm trying a little hyperbolic.
I'm trying to as well. I don't know why I remember that September 11th caused a dip here. It must have caused a dip in something else. But no, it's not. Chat. It's not the same. It's not the Jackson Hickel you think it is. Shut up. Anyway. Yeah. No. It's
I made that mistake too.
Yeah. It's a funny name. No, I don't believe it. Sorry, I'm going to need more.
No,
this is essentially like,
totally fine.
your country has spent the past two and a half centuries desperately fighting to secure economic control over the developing world, but actually it's like very trivial and it didn't actually matter that much anyway. And the amount of our GDP that we would lose by not doing it is equivalent to like negating 1 year of growth. Maybe even not that much. Like you could basically hit freeze on the GDP growth graph for like 9 months, and that would be enough to equal us cutting off trade from the entire developing world. That, like, to me, like, I feel like, can you link those papers from Jackson Hickle?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. For sure.
Yeah,
well, all right. I think
it's
at the point of I just don't believe in. I need to do more research. I feel like that's you said you had to get out about 5:30 anyway, or 5:30 Central Time. So I, unless you wanted to talk about anything else.
No, I have to go. There's pasta waiting for me, unfortunately.
What kind?
It has bacon in it. That's all I know. It's probably rigatoni or something.
All right, well, that sounds good. Yeah, so I guess, closing statement, obviously, laid out there on the debate. I feel like I've justified my points. I'll link you all those papers. Thanks for letting me on, give me the platform. Again, if anyone's interested in kind of a progressive capitalist sort of interpretation of economics, you could say, that's my YouTube channel, Econoboi. And that's all I have to say.
You take care, okay?
All right, you too. Have a good day.
Bye. All right, we're on an
Cool.
unrelenting economic research arc until we find out why that guy was wrong.